From the brutal depths of the 5th to the 15th century, when a bad romance meant more than just an awkward text message. When ghosting could get you banished or worse, how did people actually end things? When love soured and vows felt like chains, what did medieval couples do to break free? Number 5. Public shaming and community judgment. In the winding cobblestone streets of medieval villages, where every whisper carried from the communal well to the shadowed corners of the churchyard, personal lives were never truly private. A marriage, even one that seemed strong as the stone walls of a keep, could be shattered by the grinding gears of community judgment. This was not a quiet, private parting. This was a spectacle, often loud and deeply humiliating, designed to enforce social norms and carve a chasm between spouses. One of the most vivid and chilling examples of this communal breakup method was the charivari, also known as rough music. Imagine a situation where a spouse, perhaps a husband, had acted in a way deemed contrary to accepted marital conduct. Maybe he had publicly beaten his wife, a deplorable act, even in those harsh times, though domestic violence was regrettably common. Perhaps he had taken a mistress openly, flaunting his disregard for his marital vows. Or perhaps a wife had displayed what the community considered unseemly independence, challenging the established order in a way that upset the delicate balance of village life. Whatever the perceived transgression, if it was egregious enough to ignite the collective fury of the populace, a charivari could be organized. The sounds would begin subtly at first, a distant rumble that grew into a cacophony. As dusk settled, obscuring the familiar outlines of the village, the air would fill with discordant noises. Villagers would gather, often armed with pots, pans, ladles, and anything else that could make a terrible din. They might bring cowbells, whistles, and even makeshift trumpets crafted from animal horns. Procession would form a serpentine line of masked or disguised figures, their faces often obscured by soot or crude cloth. They would march towards the offending household, their footsteps heavy on the packed earth, the rhythmic clatter of their instruments echoing through the night. Target, the spouse or couple being shamed, would likely already be cowering inside, the rising crescendo of noise a terrifying announcement of their public undoing. Crowd would surround the house, sometimes pelting it with rotten vegetables or mud. Their shouts would be laced with mockery and condemnation. They might chant rhyming couplets that recounted the alleged transgressions, turning private shame into a public ballad of disgrace. For example, chronicles from 14th century France describe charivaris aimed at men who married significantly younger women, or at women who ruled their husbands. The sheer volume of noise was meant to be deafening, penetrating every nook and cranny of the accused's home, leaving no escape from the relentless assault on their dignity. This was a full sensory experience of humiliation, designed to isolate the target from the very community they depended on. Performance could last for hours, sometimes extending for several nights. The intent was not just to shame, but to pressure, to force a change in behavior, or in the context of a failing marriage, to force one party out of the marital home, or to sever the relationship entirely through social ostracization. Persons subjected to such an ordeal would find their standing in the community utterly annihilated. Their reputation would be in tatters, their honor irrevocably stained. No one would want to trade with them, no one would invite them to feasts, and their very presence would be a source of discomfort and avoidance. This social excommunication could be a more potent force than any legal decree, effectively ending a marriage by making continued cohabitation and interaction impossible within the bounds of that specific community. Historical records indicate that charivaris were particularly prevalent in cases where traditional gender roles were perceived to have been violated. A man who was seen as weak or submissive to his wife, or a woman who was too assertive, could become targets. There were instances reported in medieval England, for example, where a woman who remarried too quickly after her husband's death might face a charivari, the community judging her haste as disrespectful to the deceased, and a breach of social decorum. Collective judgment of the community, expressed through this raucous and terrifying ritual, often served as an unspoken divorce decree, enforced not by law, but by the relentless pressure of public opinion. It was a brutal way to break up, leaving one or both parties utterly isolated and bereft of social support. The shame was not a fleeting discomfort. It was a brand, burned into their very existence, often for the remainder of their days in that place. The lingering echoes of the pots and pans, the shouts and jeers, would haunt their memories, a constant reminder of their public undoing. This method of breakup was a stark testament to the power of community in a world where individual identity was deeply intertwined with one's place within the collective. It demonstrated that social death could be as effective as any legal or physical separation in severing marital bonds. Number 4. Accusation of heresy or witchcraft. When love turned to loathing in the medieval era, and one party wished to escape the bonds of marriage with extreme prejudice, a chillingly effective method involved leveraging the fervent religious fears of the time. An accusation of heresy or witchcraft was not just a serious charge. It was a death sentence both physically and socially for the accused, and an immediate, irreversible severance of all ties, including marital ones. This was not a breakup that allowed for negotiation or reconciliation. This was a complete and utter destruction of the accused's life, and by extension, their marriage. The power of the church in medieval society was absolute, permeating every aspect of daily life, from the smallest personal choices to the grandest political maneuvers. To be labeled a heretic, someone holding beliefs contrary to the established doctrine, was to be branded an enemy of God and man. To be accused of witchcraft, of practicing dark magic and consorting with malevolent forces, was to be seen as an agent of pure evil. These were not minor squabbles. These were matters of eternal salvation and the very fabric of cosmic order. A disgruntled spouse, perhaps one seeking an annulment that the church would not grant, or simply wanting to be rid of their partner without the inconvenience of waiting for death or orchestrating desertion, could make such a devastating accusation. Imagine a scenario in a 13th century German village. A woman, perhaps, felt trapped in a marriage to a man she despised. The church's strict rules made divorce impossible. Annulment was a long shot, requiring proof of pre-existing impediments or non-consummation, which was often difficult to establish. But if she could, with cunning and malicious intent, plant seeds of suspicion about her husband's religious orthodoxy or his dealings with the supernatural, she could initiate a chain of events that would obliterate their marriage entirely. She might subtly suggest to neighbors or local clergy that her husband spoke strangely about church dogma, questioning certain tenets or expressing unorthodox views. She might discover a strange amulet hidden among his belongings or hint at odd noises coming from his workshop at night. Each small hint, each carefully placed rumor, would build a cumulative narrative of suspicion. In an era where superstition and genuine religious piety were deeply intertwined, these whispers could quickly escalate into a roaring firestorm. Once the accusation gained traction, typically through local gossip reaching the ears of a zealous inquisitor or a fearful local lord, the process would begin. The accused would be apprehended often in a public and humiliating manner. Their property would be seized, their reputation instantly ruined. The trial that followed was often less about justice and more about confession, often extracted through brutal means. Medieval legal procedures regarding heresy and witchcraft were notoriously biased against the accused. The burden of proof often shifted, and spectral evidence such as dreams or visions of the accuser could be admitted. Consider the grim reality of the inquisitorial process. The accused would be imprisoned often in dark, cold cells. They would face relentless questioning, sometimes for days or weeks. Torture, while officially supposed to be a last resort, was frequently employed to extract confessions. The thought of their spouse, the person who once shared their bed and their life being the one who initiated this nightmare, would be an unimaginable betrayal. For the community, the accused was now an outcast, a monster, a threat to their very souls. Their marriage, whatever it once was, ceased to exist the moment the first formal accusation was uttered. The legal and social ramifications of such a charge were absolute. If found guilty, the consequences were dire. Heretics and witches were often burned at the stake, a public spectacle designed to cleanse the community of evil and warn others against similar transgressions. The execution of the accused spouse was the ultimate irreversible breakup. There was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation, no shared future. Even if the accused were merely imprisoned for life, or forced to recant and live a life of penance, their marital bond was effectively dissolved. The social stigma attached to the family of a condemned heretic or witch was immense. Often leading to their own ostracization, children might be disinherited or shunned. The name of the accused, and by extension their spouse, would be forever associated with infamy. Historical examples, though often skewed by the records of the inquisitors themselves, show the terrifying potential of such accusations. During the peak of the witch hunts in the late medieval period and early modern era, spouses sometimes accused each other, or family members accused their relatives, often driven by fear, greed, or personal vendettas. While not always directly initiated for the sole purpose of ending a marriage, the effect was undeniably the same: an immediate, brutal, and often fatal separation. This method represented the ultimate weaponization of belief and fear, turning the sacred institution of marriage into a crucible of destruction. The echoes of the accusations, the cries of the condemned, the crackle of the pyre, these were the grim sounds of a medieval breakup, tearing lives apart with religious fervor and unyielding cruelty. The accused's world was not just broken, it was annihilated. Number 3. Desertion and Vanishing Act. In an era without easily accessible official records, without widespread communication networks, and without a centralized tracking system for individuals, simply disappearing was a surprisingly effective, if brutal, method of ending a medieval marriage. This was the ultimate ghosting, but on a grand and irreversible scale, leaving the abandoned spouse in a perpetual state of legal limbo and social uncertainty. There were no messy court proceedings, no public shaming. There was just an empty space where a person used to be, a void that spoke volumes of a relationship utterly severed. Life for the common person in the medieval period was often harsh, precarious, and centered around localized communities. Most individuals lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Travel was arduous and dangerous, usually undertaken out of necessity rather than leisure. Therefore, when someone vanished, especially a spouse, it was a profound event that sent ripples of confusion and despair through the lives left behind. This was not merely going to live in another part of the same village. This involved literally leaving, often under the cloak of night, with no intention of returning. Consider the plight of a peasant husband, perhaps in 12th century France, burdened by debt, a meager harvest, or a family he felt unable to support. He might have felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of his marriage, unable to find a legal or a socially acceptable way out. Or perhaps a wife in an abusive situation saw no other recourse. Church forbade divorce, and annulment was an expensive, lengthy process, often reserved for the wealthy and powerful. For the common folk, escape was often the only option. So one day, they simply would not be there. Their clothes, their tools, their meager possessions, all gone. No note, no explanation, just absence. The immediate aftermath for the abandoned spouse would be a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing dread. Days would turn into weeks, then months, then years, without a word. The abandoned wife, for instance, might initially assume her husband had been waylaid by bandits, fallen ill on the road, or been pressed into service by a passing lord. Hope would slowly turn to despair. The reality of his deliberate departure would eventually sink in. This was a deep betrayal, a complete renunciation of vows and responsibilities. The legal and social implications for the deserted spouse were profound. In the eyes of the church, they were still married. They could not remarry, as doing so would constitute bigamy, a grave sin. This meant a lifetime of solitude. Denied the companionship and support of a new partner for a woman, this was particularly devastating. Without a husband, her social standing could plummet. She might lose access to land or resources that were tied to her husband's family. Her economic stability would be severely compromised, especially as she had children to support. She might be forced to rely on charity, or in dire circumstances, resort to begging or other desperate measures to survive. Records from manorial courts in medieval England occasionally show cases of men who simply vanished from their villages, leaving their wives and children to fend for themselves. These men might seek anonymity in a distant town, join a mercenary band, or even attempt to start a new life under a different name. The vast, often sparsely populated landscapes of medieval Europe offered many places to disappear, especially for those without significant landholdings or noble status. The lack of reliable identification or travel documents meant that someone determined to vanish could often succeed, at least for a time. The act of desertion was not only a personal tragedy, but a social disruption. Community might view the deserted spouse with pity or sometimes suspicion, wondering if they had somehow driven their partner away. Children of such unions would be left without a father figure, or less commonly, a mother, facing an uncertain future. The psychological toll of living in a state of perpetual limbo, never knowing if their spouse was dead or alive, if they would ever return, or if they had simply chosen to abandon them, would be immense. There was no closure, no finality, only an open wound of absence. For the one doing the deserting, the act itself was an escape, a brutally effective way to end a marriage without confrontation. But it was also a perilous choice. They would be forced to live a life of anonymity, constantly looking over their shoulder, fearful of being recognized or found. They would forfeit their previous identity, their home, and often any possessions they could not carry. They might live a life of hardship, always on the move, always hiding their past. Yet for some, this life of rootless freedom, however bleak, was preferable to the confines of an unbearable marriage. This method of breakup was a silent stream, a desperate flight, leaving behind a profound emptiness and an unresolved tangle of broken vows. Number 2. Entering a religious order. In the spiritual landscape of the medieval world, where the church held immense sway over every aspect of life, there was a deeply profound and often permanent way to end a marriage. Taking religious vows, this was not a divorce in the modern sense. It was a spiritual separation, a symbolic death to the secular world, which effectively dissolved the marital bond. While not explicitly framed as a breakup method, its practical outcome was precisely that: the complete and irrevocable severance of a marriage, leaving the remaining spouse legally and socially free, though often with a profound sense of loss or abandonment. For many, the monastic life was a calling, a genuine desire to dedicate their existence to God. But for others, particularly those trapped in unhappy or unfulfilling marriages, the cloister offered a powerful, sanctioned escape. The church, while upholding the sanctity and indissolubility of marriage, also held the spiritual life in the highest esteem. A man taking vows as a monk or a woman as a nun was seen as choosing a higher path, a more perfect devotion. This choice, if genuinely made, superseded the earthly bond of marriage, Imagine a scene in 14th century Italy. A noblewoman, perhaps married off at a young age to an older, cruel, or simply unloving husband, might find herself despairing of her earthly lot. Divorce was not an option. Annulment was rare and usually reserved for political maneuvering within the highest echelons of society. Yet, she yearned for freedom, for a life where she could dedicate her mind and spirit to something beyond her marital misery. She might, after much contemplation and perhaps secret correspondence with an abbess, decide to seek entry into a convent. The process was solemn and irreversible. She would need to secure permission sometimes from her husband, though often the church would prioritize a genuine spiritual calling over a husband's objections, especially if he could be shown to have contributed to her unhappiness or if he too wished to dissolve the union. Once admitted, she would begin a period of novitiate, a time of testing and spiritual instruction. This was the final chance for either party to reconsider. But once the solemn vows were taken, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the transformation was complete. The ceremony itself was a powerful symbol of separation. For a nun, it often involved a symbolic ritual of death to the world. She would wear a white wedding dress, then have her hair shorn and don the humble habit of the order. This was her new wedding to Christ, and it effectively rendered her dead to her former life, including her marriage. She was no longer a wife in the eyes of the church or society. Her property, if she had any, would often be transferred to the convent or to her family. She was now a servant of God, her identity completely subsumed by her new spiritual role. The deserted spouse, whether husband or wife, would be left behind. They were no longer considered married in the eyes of the church, despite the lack of a formal divorce decree. They were technically free to remarry, as their former spouse was now dead to the world. This was a crucial distinction and a stark contrast to mere desertion, where the abandoned spouse remained legally bound. This method provided a clean, albeit spiritually loaded, break. However, it came at a significant personal cost. Person entering the order was cut off from their family, their friends, and the wider secular society. Communication was limited, and visits were rare and supervised. They lived a life of rigorous discipline, prayer, and labor within the cloistered walls. Historical records contain numerous instances of this phenomenon, sometimes driven by genuine piety, sometimes by social pressure, and sometimes as a mutually agreeable way to end a difficult marriage without scandal. For instance, some medieval monarchs and nobles, whose marriages were politically inconvenient but indissoluble by other means, would persuade one spouse to enter a religious order. It was a more elegant solution than annulment for complex cases, particularly if the annulment grounds were weak. Such an arrangement could preserve appearances while achieving separation. There are accounts of royal consorts, like Eleanor of Aquitaine's first husband, Louis VII of France, later entering a monastery, though his was post-annulment. But more directly, historical figures like Theophano, Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, was a powerful widow who encouraged her daughter Matilda to enter the convent of Quedlinburg as a child, effectively removing her from marriage market machinations, though this wasn't a marital breakup. However, the principle applied to adult spouses seeking an escape. The impact on the remaining spouse was complex. They were legally free, but the emotional scars of being abandoned for God, or simply for the monastic life, could be profound. They might face questions from the community about why their spouse chose such a path. For some, it might have been a relief, a release from an unhappy union. For others, it was a source of great sorrow and confusion. Regardless of the emotional aftermath, the practical effect was undeniable. The marriage was over. The solemn ringing of the bells during the vow ceremony, the shaved head, the new habit, these were the sounds and sights of a medieval marriage ending, not with a bang, but with a sacred lifelong commitment to another higher power. It was a breakup that resonated, not just in the earthly realm, but in the spiritual one, an ultimate surrender that paradoxically granted a form of freedom. Number 1. Annulment by ecclesiastical authority. The medieval church held the absolute power over marriage, deeming it a sacred sacrament, indissoluble by human will. There was no concept of divorce, as we understand it today, where a marriage could be legally ended at the will of either party. However, there was a loophole, a meticulous, often agonizingly slow process known as annulment. This was not about ending a valid marriage, but about declaring that the marriage had, in fact, never been valid in the first place due to some impediment present at the time of its formation. This was the ultimate church-sanctioned breakup, a legal and spiritual undoing that could reshape the lives of individuals, and sometimes the very course of nations. The grounds for annulment were specific and often complex, requiring deep theological and legal interpretation. One common reason was pre-contract, meaning one of the parties had already entered into a binding marital agreement with someone else before the current marriage. Another significant ground was consanguinity, or affinity, meaning the couple was related by blood or marriage within prohibited degrees, sometimes as far as the 7th degree. This could be a complex web to untangle, often requiring extensive genealogical research. Non-consummation was another potent ground. If a marriage was never physically consummated, it could be argued that the sacrament was incomplete. Other grounds included lack of consent, duress, or one party being secretly impotent or too young. The process itself was formidable. It began with a petition to the ecclesiastical court, often a bishop's court, or for more significant cases, directly to the papal curia in Rome. Petitioner had to present compelling evidence that an impediment existed at the time of the wedding. This was where the brutality of the method often lay. Evidence could involve bringing in witnesses to testify about intimate details of the couple's life, or proving distant family connections that neither party might have been fully aware of at the time of their vows. Consider the famous agonizing case of King Henry VIII of England and Catherine of Aragon in the 16th century. Though stretching slightly past the typical medieval period, it perfectly illustrates the ruthless nature of this process and its roots in medieval canon law. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled so he could marry Anne Boleyn, and crucially, secure a male heir. His argument centered on Catherine having been previously married to his elder brother, Arthur. Henry argued that this first marriage was consummated, making his own marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, illicit under biblical law, specifically Leviticus, which forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife. Catherine, however, steadfastly maintained her first marriage was not consummated, which would have allowed her marriage to Henry to be valid under another biblical passage. The ensuing legal battle lasted for years, consuming immense resources and causing widespread political and religious turmoil. Papal legates were sent, detailed theological arguments were debated, and evidence was meticulously scrutinized. Catherine herself was put on trial. Her personal life, her virginity, and her marital relations with Arthur and Henry were laid bare before a court of men. The immense pressure exerted on her, the public scrutiny, the agonizing waiting for a judgment from Rome, was a form of psychological torture. This process, while seemingly legalistic, was deeply personal and incredibly invasive. It stripped away all pretense of privacy, exposing the most intimate aspects of a couple's relationship to public and ecclesiastical judgment. For commoners, while less dramatic in its political impact, an annulment was still a harrowing experience. A village couple might find their marital validity questioned if a long-lost relative suddenly appeared, revealing a previously unknown kinship, or perhaps one spouse seeking to escape the union might fabricate grounds for non-consummation, leading to intrusive physical examinations or humiliating questioning in open court. The individual seeking the annulment had to be ruthlessly determined, willing to expose private matters and possibly invent or exaggerate facts to fit the church's strict criteria. Person resisting the annulment, often the woman, faced an uphill battle. If an annulment was granted, she could be stripped of her social standing, her dowry and her children could be declared illegitimate, impacting their inheritance and future prospects. The granting of an annulment was not a declaration that the couple was no longer married. It was a pronouncement that they had never been truly married at all. This meant that any children born of the union were technically illegitimate, a devastating blow in a society that valued lineage and inheritance above almost all else. The perceived nullity of the marriage could also carry a heavy social stigma, implying deception or a serious transgression on the part of one or both individuals. The lengthy appeals process, often spanning years or even decades, meant that individuals remained in agonizing limbo, unable to move forward with their lives. The emotional toll was immense. For the powerful, an annulment could clear the path for a more advantageous alliance. But for the common folk, it could signify financial ruin and social shame. The very meticulousness of the process, its unwavering adherence to canon law, and its ultimate power to render a marriage non-existent made it a brutally effective, albeit rare way to sever ties. The rustle of parchments, the solemn pronouncements of judges, the theological debates echoing in grand halls, these were the sounds of a medieval breakup, tearing apart not just a relationship but the very legitimacy of a shared past.